In the next series of videos, we're going to discuss wills and trusts. As the old saying goes, you can't take it with you. So you only have two options for your material goods. And when I say material goods, personal property and real property. And that is control. You can control where your assets go after you die, or you just don't bother and you don't have any sort of plan in place and you leave it to chaos when you leave. And that is certainly what happened in a number of high-profile celebrity cases that we're going to talk about in the next series of videos. Prince, for example, he died without a will. He was a resident of Minnesota and he died unexpectedly and had no will. And when somebody dies without a will, we say that they died intestate, which means that the state laws where the deceased lived, was a resident of, will govern the distribution of property. And in Prince's case, at the time of his death, he was worth approximately $200 million in assets. And this didn't even include any of the master recordings of unreleased music, which was vast in his collection. And as we know, that could lead to even more potential earning power and for whoever owns or gets that property. Aretha Franklin, another celebrity who died in the last few years. She was a resident of Michigan, and she did have a will, but then she decided afterwards that she was going to make some written notes or handwrite out a will. We call it a holographic will. And the idea is the person handwrites out their will. It was thought that she didn't have a will for the longest time until they heirs or family members found notes expressing her wishes. They were found in a couch cushion. And her assets were valued at about $80 million at the time of her death. And the question the court had to decide, were her notes a legally enforceable will? And Robin Williams, who was a resident of California, he had a will and he had outlined the specifics for his assets. However, it left out certain things in the will, and there was some confusing, it wasn't clear enough, his will. So this caused a dispute that went into court. I think it took a year or two to resolve this. His will left over $100 million in assets. He had 3 kids from a previous marriage, and he had a second wife. So the dispute was between wife and his children with regards to his home that he left behind. So disputes of one's property can get nasty, messy, it can take a long time, as well as there's a lot of money that goes through the court system that you have to pay for to have these wills and decisions about wills decided. And in the last 3, the Prince case, Aretha Franklin, and Robin Williams, just to close it out, all 3 of these cases ended up in court. Aretha Franklin's went all the way to a jury to have to decide. Prince and Robin Williams, they settled the case. Prince's lasted 6 years before there was a settlement. So here's what's happened, and I'm going to simplify, but for Prince, his heirs, he didn't have a wife, he didn't have children, so his heirs were 1 full sibling and 5 half siblings. He didn't, and his parents had passed away. So the case, like I said, almost 6 years, millions of dollars in legal fees, and the issues that were involved were the value of the state. You had to figure out exactly what the value of the state was, which was subject to very high tax obligations. So the IRS was involved. Managing the release of his unreleased music was an issue, distribution and sharing in all the assets. He owned a lot of real property in Minnesota. In 2022, it was settled. All parties involved had to agree. The value of the estate was $156 million after IRS adjustments, to which it was then divided equally amongst his siblings. Sadly, during this case, while this case was pending, 2 of his siblings died during the process, but their shares then get passed on to their children, and we'll talk about how that happens. The management of the music was turned over to a professional music company to ensure proper release, handling of the releases. In January of this year, however, 2024, the siblings brought a lawsuit against managers and trustees of the state for breach of trust. So we'll see what happens. Still ongoing issues. Robin Williams' case, despite having a will, family members can still dispute it, specifically if the will terms are not clear enough. Unfortunately, Williams didn't make arrangements for some of his personal belongings, so his wife, who's not the mother of his children, argued that since she was left the actual home, the contents inside were also hers. But the children argued that the possessions were to pass to them. The case was ultimately settled a year later after his death. Some of the settlement details weren't made released. But the wife ended up getting a few belongings, but the children ended up with the majority. And Aretha Franklin, 5-year battle. Jury had to make a decision about those handwritten notes. If she died without a will, her 4 sons would have been the heirs with an even distribution, but her handwritten notes left out her eldest son from the distribution, and it simply stated that the other 3 sons, quote unquote, check on Clarence's welfare and oversee his needs. That was her handwritten notes. The notes didn't have any of the necessary formalities that a will must have that we'll talk about. And the reason for formalities is to prevent fraudulent activity. So in order for the notes to be considered as her will, it has to be authenticated, meaning is this her handwriting and did she really write this? So the jury had to decide that, and in less than an hour after deliberation, that handwritten document that was found in her under a couch cushion in her home, the jury said it will be her will. It is a valid will. So as you will see in this section, wills have certain formalities that are associated with them to authenticate them as legal enforceable documents. A holographic will or a handwritten will generally they generally don't come with the formalities. So the question is, when will we consider them valid? Because there is a process for that. And they can ultimately become enforceable documents as long as they can be authenticated. So we'll discuss those things as well as these objectives at the end of this section. You should be able to outline those requirements of a will, discuss how we can amend or revoke a will, describe what we call intestation, intestate distribution or intestate law of property, meaning if somebody died without a will, how it's going to be distributed, and identify the elements of a trust. We'll talk about what is a trust, but we'll talk about the elements of a trust and its administration.